this morning is from the Gospel of Luke. Now on that same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem. And they found the 11 and their companions gathered there. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road, and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. May God add blessing to the reading, hearing, and living of this holy word this day.
Thanks be to God.
Please be seated.
When I was traveling back and forth to California to go to seminary, it was always a kind of a letdown when I would get home and get to the airport and exit the plane and go out into the main concourse, because there was never anybody there to welcome me home. Now, I don't say that to make you feel sad for me. I'm just saying that I noticed a lot of times how much more fun it was if you had somebody waiting for you that recognized you when you got off the plane and acted like they were happy to see you. Maybe you've had that experience, walking in someplace and no one recognizing who you are. And suddenly you feel like the odd one out, right? No one knows you. Well, our story in our scripture today is about just that thing. It's about not being recognized for who he was, and that's Jesus. I smile when this story gets read. I think I've shared a couple of times with you. These stories about Jesus and disciples are really pretty funny, because there's so much satire and so much interest in them about the poor folks that don't get it, especially when they're talking with Jesus. How many of them have said things because they didn't know it was Jesus. And this is another one of those stories. And so we're going to go back in time. For us, in our celebration of the church, it's been a couple of weeks since Easter, but this is a story that happens on Easter, on that first Easter morning. And so we're backtracking in time just a little bit. And so the story is that a couple of the disciples, Cleopas and another friend, are walking back maybe home to Emmaus, wherever that might be. And a stranger shows up, which is probably not unusual for walking around in that time period. People were walking all around all the time. And they stop, and they're just looking really, really sad. And of course the stranger says, well, what's going on, guys? And it's as if they said to him, that saying, you must have been living under a rock, because everybody's talking about it. I mean, it's all anyone is talking about. It's about Jesus of Nazareth. You can't not know what was taking place. And Jesus says, well, what things? And so they begin to educate this stranger on all that's been going on. And it's just funny to me, and I know that this has a purpose, the reason they don't recognize him, there's a reason for that, but it still strikes me as odd. And I guess I get that because, I've been places where I didn't get recognized, so, I guess it could happen. I've been places where I haven't recognized other people that I know. When I worked for the post office, I saw a lot of postal carriers that came in. And I checked them in and out from their routes each day, and so I got to know them really well. I ran into a guy at a Home Depot one afternoon, and he came up to me and said hi, and I said hi, and he asked how things were going, and I said okay, and I had no idea who he was. And he said some other things that I don't remember because my mind was going 100 miles an hour trying to place who this guy was. So he walks off, says goodbye, walks off, and I'm wandering around Home Depot going, who's that guy, who's that guy? And then I see him again, and I go, oh, I know. He's one of the letter carriers from the post office where I work. But you see, he wasn't in a uniform. I didn't recognize him because he was out of the scene where I knew him from. He was out of context for me. And so I didn't recognize him. See, I think this is what happened that day, that first Easter on the road to Emmaus for these two disciples. They remembered the dead Jesus, and the risen Jesus was out of context. I think that's why they maybe didn't recognize him. I don't know. Something had been placed over their eyes. Scripture tells us that, whatever that was. And there was a point for them not recognizing him for the time that happened. But part of me wants to be that person in the background that's looking over their shoulder and going, these guys look at them, explaining all about who Jesus is to Jesus. They're going to feel so silly when they find out who he is. So they tell him the whole thing. He was a prophet, he was condemned to death, he was crucified, we hoped he would have been the one that was going to set Israel free. And then the woman came and they told us that he wasn't there, and we went there and sure enough he wasn't there. And then somebody said, well, they appeared to Simon, and it's just, everything was just beyond our understanding. And they're talking to Jesus, and they don't see him. No recognition, no spark in their eye, nothing. Imagine what it must have been like to have all of that personal, firsthand information and evidence about Jesus being risen from the dead and not recognizing who Jesus was. Imagine walking down that road that day, having that sadness in your heart that goes beyond explanation or understanding because someone that you loved and cared for has been so cruelly killed. And imagine trying to have to put into words those feelings and emotions to someone that you don't know, that doesn't have a clue what's just happened. Imagine all of that and still not recognizing who Jesus was as they stood there staring at him like he was a stranger. Of course, I have said this before, we have that advantage of hindsight. We know how the story ends. And maybe it's not too hard to imagine. Maybe you've had those kinds of experiences. But I think what it reveals to us is that Easter had only just happened for them. Easter's been a couple of weeks ago for us. But the story that we need to take from this is that God's love for us and God's grace and forgiveness for us is still as important as it was that first Sunday morning. You see, we get all excited about Easter. We come, we dress up the church, we dress up ourselves, we sing, Christ the Lord is risen today, we put colors out and we sing joyously. And then the next day happens. And that brightness of Easter morning, that scent of Easter flowers, when we get a mile or two down the road, begins to fade. And soon the Easter songs that were in our ears on Easter morning turn into the car horns of crazy drivers out in the world. And the harsh realities of life come rushing back on us. And everyday life begins to happen, and our worries, our frustrations, our work, our family, all of those things begin to take over the joy that we had at Easter. And maybe we get more frustrated, more bitter, more tired, whatever it is, and pretty soon Easter is just a distant memory. You can imagine how heartsick they were on that road to Emmaus. All of their hopes and dreams have been dashed. They say that we had such high hopes. We have to ask ourselves, how far down the road from Easter do we stop and look at one another and go, what's it all about? Where's the joy of Easter today? So it's hard for us to understand in this story of how these two faithful disciples who had been so close to Jesus as he lived and was there and saw that he was not there in the grave anymore, how they could have stood by him and walked with him and talked with him and not recognize him. Because certainly I'm thinking, I would have got it. But they couldn't understand how he could be alive. And so for that moment, for them, it was still Good Friday. It was not Easter yet. Because they left to go home disappointed, disillusioned, and sad. But their experience on that road was about to take a turn, and they didn't even know it. Because here comes a stranger, someone they don't recognize. And as they begin to walk and continue to walk and journey, Jesus begins to tell them all of the stories and reveals all of the information about Jesus and how important it was for him to come and the necessity of him coming to be the Savior for the world. And they begin to have insight into the stories. They begin to relive Israel's past. And when it was time for them to be at home and Jesus seemed to be going on his way, those disciples practiced good hospitality and invited him in, a stranger, to eat with them. And as he broke bread, it dawned on them, it was revealed to them. Their eyes were opened and they knew who he was. You see, this story of eyes being opened by a sharing of a meal with Jesus is our story yet today. And it can happen for us each and every time that we think of the resurrected Christ, every time that we celebrate a communion and receive a piece of broken bread and drink from a cup. Our eyes can be opened to who the resurrected Jesus is for us. Because like those disciples, we're not going to be able to walk down the road and suddenly have Jesus walk beside us. But, it really happens all the time. We may not know it and we don't see Jesus, but Jesus is there. We can have that same transforming experience that those disciples on the walk to Emmaus had each and every day that we walk the road with Christ by our side. Every time we worship together, every time we do a small group study together, every time we eat together, we can be, again, those disciples on that road, and Jesus can be revealed to us. Every time we remember the stories that Jesus told at the time that he was alive, and we tell them again and again and again, we can be the disciples on the road to Emmaus. Every time we remember the love that Jesus had for the world and the message that he gave, we too can be those disciples on the road to Emmaus that day. Because I believe that the resurrected Christ is available to us, actually lives within us always in every part of our daily lives. It says in the scripture that when Cleopas and his companion began to realize who Jesus was as they were eating, they thought back for a moment and they said, "Didn't we feel our hearts warmed when we were talking to him on the road?" Maybe that should have been a clue, huh? And what was their response to having supper and realizing who Jesus was? They were so excited that they decided to walk 7 miles back to Jerusalem at night. I don't think I would have done that. But we too have to have that kind of excitement. We too have to have that kind of joy in realizing and understanding who the resurrected Christ is in our lives. And if we don't do that, if we don't open our eyes and understand that Christ is with us every day, every step that we take, then we don't recognize what it is that we really have. And what we really have is the possibility for exceptional lives of joy and thanksgiving. When we encounter the resurrected Christ, we can't help but want to share that good news with others. And we don't even have to walk 7 miles. We can just get in the car and go. What the disciples discovered on that road to Emmaus that first Easter can and should be and will be a part of our lives as we walk the road of our lives. We just have to have our eyes open enough so that we recognize that Christ is there with us. John Wesley used that term about a heart strangely warmed, you might remember, in his conversion story. Maybe it was because John Wesley had read that reminder of the disciples on the road to Emmaus. But whatever it is, we have to ask ourselves, will we be attentive enough to recognize that warming of our hearts when Christ is present with us, or will we just think we've got a bit of indigestion? Will we use our warmed hearts to share God's love through Christ with those that we meet? Will we use our warmed hearts to reveal God's love to others? Will we acknowledge Christ's presence with us every day so that we can help heal a broken world? So that we can offer healing and hope to those that we meet? That's a question we have to ask ourselves. Will we pay attention when God warms our hearts? Will we be able to recognize that Christ is right there with us? Or will we simply continue to walk through life with our eyes